when Mount Olympus still pierced the heavens like a golden spear thrust into the heart of creation, when divine light cascaded from marble halls and the very air hummed with immortal power, the gods ruled with absolute dominion over every realm, every soul, every breath drawn by mortal lungs. Their empire stretched beyond the boundaries of imagination, encompassing not just the earthly domains of ancient Greece, but the cosmic forces that governed life, death, time, and fate itself. Zeus commanded thunder that could shatter mountains. Poseidon's rage could swallow entire continents beneath crushing waves. Hades held dominion over every soul that had ever lived or ever would live. They were the architects of reality, the arbiters of destiny, the undisputed masters of all existence. Yet today, Mount Olympus lies in ruins. The golden halls that once echoed with divine laughter now stand as broken monuments to hubris. The throne rooms, where gods once debated the fates of mortals, have become tombs filled with divine corpses. The very foundations of reality that the Olympians built over millennia of rule have crumbled into cosmic dust. Where once immortal beings walked as living embodiments of natural law, now only silence reigns, broken occasionally by the howling winds that carry the ashes of dead gods across the barren peaks. This is not a tale of gradual decline or political intrigue. This is not the story of an empire that slowly rotted from within over centuries of decadence. This is the chronicle of the most catastrophic war in the history of all mythologies, a conflict so brutal and absolute that it redefined the very concept of divine power. In less than a decade, the mightiest pantheon ever to rule over creation was reduced to scattered corpses and haunted memories by a single mortal warrior, whose rage burned hotter than the fires of Olympus itself. The ancient scrolls speak of Kratos of Sparta, but they fail to capture the true scope of what he became. They describe him as a god of war, but he transcended even that cosmic role to become something far more terrifying, the embodiment of divine consequence. Every cruel act committed by the Olympians, every mortal life destroyed for divine amusement, every prayer ignored while gods feasted in their golden halls, all of it found its reckoning in the scarred flesh and burning eyes of one who had been betrayed by those he served. But the story begins long before Kratos drew his first breath, long before the first Spartan warrior ever raised a bronze spear in defiance of fate. The Olympians believed themselves eternal. They believed their power absolute. They believed their dominion over mortal lives was not just their right, but the natural order of all creation. Zeus, king of gods, commanded respect through fear. His lightning bolt was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of divine authority that could end any rebellion with a single thunderous crack. His word was law, not because it was just, but because disobedience meant annihilation. For thousands of years, this system worked. Mortals prayed, gods answered when it pleased them, and the cosmic order remained stable. But every empire, no matter how mighty, carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The Olympians, in their infinite arrogance, planted those seeds with their own hands. Every act of divine cruelty created another debt that would one day demand payment. Every mortal crushed beneath the weight of godly indifference added another stone to the foundation of their eventual downfall. They created their own executioner in the very process of exercising their power, forging the instrument of their destruction in the flames of their own heartless ambition. What the gods failed to understand, what their immortal minds could never quite grasp, was that suffering has its own power. Pain, when concentrated and refined through years of betrayal and loss, can become something that transcends the boundaries between mortal and divine. Rage, when pure enough and focused with sufficient intensity, can challenge the very foundations of cosmic law. The Olympians had grown so accustomed to being the source of others' anguish that they never considered what might happen if that anguish found a way to fight back. Ancient prophecies had warned them. The oracle at Delphi had spoken of a marked warrior who would bring about the twilight of their age. Seers across the known world had witnessed visions of burning halls and dying gods. But divine arrogance is perhaps the most absolute force in all creation. The Olympians believed they could simply kill anyone who threatened them, that raw power could overcome any prophecy, any fate, any consequence of their actions. They had defeated the Titans after all. They had bound the Furies and imprisoned the most dangerous primordial forces in the deepest chambers of Tartarus. What could one mortal possibly do against beings who commanded the very forces of nature? They would learn the answer to that question written in blood across the marble floors of their own throne rooms. They would discover that there are some forces in creation that even gods cannot control, some prices that even immortals must eventually pay. They would come to understand, in their final moments, that the universe itself has a sense of justice that operates beyond their comprehension or influence. The war in Olympus was not just a conflict between mortals and gods, it was the collision of two fundamental principles, the divine right to rule through power alone, and the mortal right to demand justice for crimes committed against the innocent. When these forces met in battle, the result was nothing less than the complete transformation of the cosmic order. Mountains were shattered, seas boiled away to nothing. The very fabric of reality was torn and rewoven as gods, who had never known defeat, discovered what it meant to face an enemy who had absolutely nothing left to lose. This is their story. This is the tale of how the mightiest gods, who ever claimed dominion over creation, met their end, not in some cosmic accident or external invasion, but through the consequences of their own choices, their own cruelty, their own absolute refusal to acknowledge that power without justice is merely tyranny waiting for its reckoning. And that reckoning, when it finally came, burned bright enough to illuminate every corner of creation and cast shadows that still linger in the ruins of what was once the greatest divine empire ever to rule over gods and mortals alike. Before Zeus ever hurled his first lightning bolt, before Poseidon commanded the seas, before Hades claimed dominion over the dead, there existed only the primordial void known as chaos. From this endless darkness emerged the first conscious beings, entities so vast and powerful that their very thoughts shaped the fundamental laws of reality. Gaia, the Earth Mother, was among the first to draw breath from the cosmic void. Her body became the solid foundation upon which all life would eventually flourish, her dreams giving birth to mountains, valleys, and the endless expanse of fertile soil that would nurture countless civilizations. But Gaia was not alone in those earliest days of creation. Uranus, the Sky Father, stretched his star-filled form across the heavens, creating the dome of night that sheltered the growing world below. Together, they brought forth the first generation of divine beings, children whose power rivaled their own cosmic parents. These were the Titans, beings of such incredible might that each one embodied fundamental aspects of existence itself. Kronos controlled time, his very presence causing moments to stretch into eternities or compress into fleeting instants. Oceanus commanded the vast waters that surrounded the world, while his sister Tethys governed the life-giving springs and rivers that flowed across Gaia's surface. For eons, this primordial family ruled over a universe that knew neither war nor betrayal. The Titans worked in harmony with their parents, shaping the world according to cosmic principles that valued balance and natural order above all else. Mountains rose and fell according to Gaia's will. The passage of time flowed smoothly under Kronos' careful guidance. The boundaries between sea and sky, earth and heaven, remained clearly defined and universally respected. Yet even in this age of cosmic harmony, the seeds of future violence were being planted. Uranus, despite his role as the Sky Father, harbored a deep fear of being overthrown by his own children. This paranoia grew with each passing eon, fed by whispered prophecies that spoke of a son who would surpass his father's power. Rather than face this threat with wisdom or courage, Uranus chose the path of tyranny. One by one, he began imprisoning his own children within Gaia's womb, condemning them to eternal darkness in the deepest chambers of the earth. Gaia's anguish at seeing her children imprisoned was beyond mortal comprehension. The Earth Mother's pain caused earthquakes that shattered newly formed continents. Her tears became acid rain that scarred the surface of the world. Her rage manifested as volcanic eruptions that painted the sky with ash and fire. But more importantly, her suffering planted the first seeds of rebellion against divine authority. She began to whisper to her remaining free children, filling their minds with thoughts of revolution and regicide. The youngest of the Titans, Kronos, proved most receptive to his mother's urgings for revenge. Gaia crafted for him a weapon, unlike any that had existed before, a scythe forged from the raw stuff of creation itself, sharp enough to cut through divine flesh, and strong enough to wound even the mightiest primordial being. Armed with this cosmic blade, Kronos waited for the perfect moment to strike at his tyrannical father. With Uranus defeated and cast into the deepest reaches of the void, Kronos claimed dominion over the cosmos. He freed his imprisoned siblings and established a new order based on Titan rule. For a time it seemed that the age of tyrannical divine authority had ended. The Titans governed with wisdom and restraint, allowing mortals to flourish and the natural world to develop according to its own rhythms rather than the whims of paranoid gods. But power, even when gained through righteous rebellion, has a way of corrupting those who wield it. As millennia passed, Kronos began to understand the fears that had driven his father to such desperate measures. When Kronos' wife Rhea began bearing children, the Titan King's paranoia reached its breaking point. Rather than imprison his offspring as Uranus had done, Kronos chose an even more horrific solution. One by one, as each child was born, he devoured them whole, condemning his own sons and daughters to eternal imprisonment within his divine stomach. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon all met this terrible fate, their divine essence trapped within their father's body, while their consciousness remained intact, aware of their imprisonment, but powerless to escape. Instead of presenting the infant Zeus to his cannibalistic father, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and offered it to Kronos in the child's place. The Titan King, so consumed by paranoia that he could no longer think clearly, swallowed the stone without question, believing he had eliminated another potential threat to his rule. Meanwhile, the real Zeus was spirited away to the island of Crete, where he would be raised in secret by nymphs and divine attendants who understood the cosmic significance of his survival. As Zeus grew to maturity in his hidden sanctuary, the injustices committed by his father continued to multiply across the cosmos. Kronos' rule, which had begun with such promise, had degenerated into a reign of terror that made even Uranus's tyranny seem mild by comparison. The Titan King's paranoia had grown so absolute that he trusted no one, suspected everyone, and responded to even the slightest perceived threat with overwhelming violence. But the young Zeus was not content to remain hidden while his father's cruelty poisoned the cosmic order. Guided by Gaia's whispered counsel, and armed with knowledge of his true destiny, Zeus began to prepare for the war that would determine the future of all divine authority. He gathered allies among the beings that Kronos had wronged, forged weapons capable of harming Titan flesh, and most importantly, developed the strategic brilliance that would allow him to defeat enemies far more experienced in the arts of cosmic warfare. The stage was set for the greatest conflict the universe had ever witnessed, a war that would pit the old order of Titan rule against the emerging power of the Olympian gods. The patterns of divine rule were being established in these primordial conflicts, patterns that would be repeated again and again throughout cosmic history. Sons would rise against fathers, power would corrupt even the most righteous rulers, fear of prophecy would drive gods to commit the very acts that ensured those prophecies would be fulfilled. And through it all, the fundamental question that would eventually destroy Olympus itself was being written into the cosmic law. If gods rule only through power and fear, what happens when someone more powerful and more fearless chooses to challenge them? The transformation of Kratos, from mortal Spartan general to the instrument of Olympus's destruction, began not with divine blessing, but with desperate human ambition colliding against the immutable laws of fate. In the mountain passes of ancient Greece, where the clash of bronze against bronze echoed through valleys carved by primordial forces, a warrior's pride would set in motion events that would topple the mightiest pantheon ever to rule over creation. Kratos had been born into a world where gods walked among mortals as living manifestations of natural law, where divine favor could elevate a man to legendary status and divine wrath could erase entire bloodlines from existence. The Spartan military machine that forged him valued only strength, discipline, and absolute victory. These values aligned perfectly with his natural temperament, creating a warrior whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his complete inability to accept defeat under any circumstances. As a general leading Spartan forces against the barbarian hordes that threatened Greek civilization, Kratos had earned a reputation for achieving impossible victories through sheer force of will and tactical innovation. His soldiers followed him, not just out of duty, but out of genuine belief that he could overcome any obstacle through sheer determination. But even the greatest mortal warrior has limitations, and those limitations would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. When Kratos found his forces surrounded by a barbarian army that outnumbered them 10-1, when his tactical options had been exhausted, and defeat seemed not just possible, but inevitable, he made the choice that would echo through cosmic history. Rather than accept the possibility of failure, rather than allow his soldiers to die unavenged, he called upon forces beyond mortal comprehension for aid. Ares, the god of war, answered that desperate prayer with divine eagerness. The Olympian deity had been watching the conflict with growing interest, recognizing in Kratos a potential instrument for his own cosmic ambitions. In that moment of desperate need, with the screams of dying Spartans filling the air around him, Kratos accepted terms that no mortal should ever agree to. The blades of chaos materialized in his hands, weapons forged in the deepest fires of the underworld, and bound to his flesh by chains that could never be broken. These were not merely tools of war, but extensions of Ares's own divine will, designed to channel the gods' bloodlust through mortal hands, while ensuring absolute obedience from their wielder. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Kratos's already formidable combat abilities were amplified beyond mortal limitations. His strength increased to levels that allowed him to cleave through entire enemy formations with single strikes. His speed became such that arrows seemed to crawl through the air while he moved between targets like divine retribution given physical form. His tactical awareness expanded to encompass entire battlefields, allowing him to perceive enemy weaknesses and exploit them with surgical precision. But these gifts came with a price that extended far beyond simple servitude to Ares. The blades of chaos fed on violence and conflict, growing stronger with each life they claimed, but also driving their wielder toward ever greater acts of brutality. What had begun as necessary military campaigns gradually transformed into orgies of destruction that served no strategic purpose beyond satisfying the weapon's endless hunger for blood. Under Ares's influence, Kratos became known throughout the ancient world as the Ghost of Sparta, a title earned through deeds so ruthless that even hardened soldiers would whisper his name in tones normally reserved for invoking demons. Entire cities fell before his advance, their populations slaughtered, not for strategic advantage, but simply because the god of war demanded constant offerings of violence and death. The corruption was subtle at first, manifesting as increased aggression in combat and a growing impatience with diplomatic solutions to military problems. But as months turned to years, Kratos found himself losing connection with the human emotions that had once motivated his desire to protect Sparta and its citizens. Compassion became weakness. Mercy became tactical error. The bonds of family and friendship that had once anchored his humanity began to seem like impediments to achieving the perfect state of warfare that Ares demanded from his champion. The climax of this corruption came during a raid on a village whose only crime was existing in territory that Ares wanted to claim for his divine domain. Kratos led the assault with his usual ruthless efficiency, cutting through the village's minimal defenses like a force of nature unleashed upon helpless mortals. In the temple at the village's center, he encountered two figures whose deaths would define the remainder of his existence. His wife Lysandra and daughter Calliope had been placed in that temple by Ares himself, disguised by divine magic, so that Kratos would not recognize them until it was too late. The god of war had orchestrated this encounter as the final step in his champion's transformation, understanding that only by destroying everything Kratos loved could he forge a weapon absolutely devoted to warfare and nothing else. The ashes of his family, fused to his skin by forces beyond his understanding, marked him as something unique in the cosmic order. He was no longer simply a mortal serving a god, nor was he a divine being commanding mortal worship. He had become a bridge between realms, carrying within himself both the limitless potential of divine power and the burning sense of justice that only mortals who have suffered at the hands of callous gods can truly possess. This transformation did not go unnoticed by the other Olympians. Zeus himself began to pay attention to reports of a mortal warrior whose rage burned hot enough to challenge divine authority. Athena watched with growing concern as Kratos' quest for vengeance against Ares threatened to upset the delicate balance of power that kept Olympian society stable. The stage was being set for conflicts that would dwarf even the legendary war between the Titans and Olympians. But this time, the central figure would not be a young god seeking to overthrow his tyrannical father, but a mortal warrior whose transformation into something beyond the normal boundaries of mortality had been purchased with the blood of innocence and fueled by grief so profound that it could power acts of vengeance on a cosmic scale. The city of Rhodes stood as a monument to human achievement under divine protection, its bronze colossus rising from the harbor like a testament to the partnership between mortal craftsmanship and godly blessing. Here, where Mediterranean trade routes converged and civilizations mingled their wisdom, Kratos had come seeking redemption for the blood that stained his hands. The oracle's prophecy had promised that serving the gods faithfully for 10 years would cleanse him of his crimes, would lift the burden of his family's death from his tortured soul. But as Kratos fought to save Rhodes from an invasion force that threatened to overwhelm its defenses, Zeus watched from Olympus with growing unease. The king of gods had observed his mortal servants rise to power with the calculating gaze of one who had himself overthrown a father figure to claim supreme authority. Every victory Kratos achieved, every impossible feat of strength and tactical brilliance he displayed, only served to confirm Zeus's growing suspicion that this mortal had become something far more dangerous than a simple champion of divine will. The attack on Rhodes was massive in scale, a coalition of enemy forces so vast that even the city's legendary defenses seemed inadequate to repel them. But Kratos had faced impossible odds before, and his divine strength allowed him to turn the tide of battle through sheer force of will. As he carved through enemy formations with the blades of chaos, as he single-handedly destroyed siege engines that should have required entire battalions to stop, the watching gods began to understand that they had helped create something beyond their ability to control. Zeus's decision to intervene came not from any desire to help Rhodes or its defenders, but from a growing certainty that Kratos represented a threat to the cosmic order that the Olympians had spent millennia perfecting. The lightning bolt that descended from the clear sky above Rhodes was not aimed at the invading forces, but at Zeus's own champion, the mortal who had served the gods faithfully but had grown too powerful to be trusted with continued existence. The divine lightning struck Kratos with enough force to level mountains, channeling Zeus's own power in a concentrated blast designed to reduce any mortal to ash and memory. But the attack, rather than destroying its target, revealed the true extent of Kratos' transformation. The bolt that should have ended his life instead drained away his divine strength, leaving him mortal once again, but still alive, still conscious, still burning with the rage that had sustained him through years of faithful service to ungrateful masters. As Kratos lay dying on the blood-soaked stones of Rhodes, his life force ebbing away, while the city he had fought to protect crumbled around him, the true nature of divine justice was revealed in all its cruel simplicity. The gods demanded absolute obedience, but offered no genuine protection in return. They promised rewards for faithful service, but delivered betrayal when that service became inconvenient. They claimed to represent order and justice, while acting according to nothing more noble than their own paranoid self-interest. But death, which had seemed like the natural conclusion to this betrayal, proved to be merely the beginning of something far more significant. As Kratos' mortal flesh failed, and his spirit prepared to descend into Hades' domain, he was intercepted by forces that had been waiting for precisely this moment. Gaia, the primordial Earth Mother, had been watching these events unfold with the patience of one who measures time in geological epochs, and she recognized in Zeus's betrayal of Kratos the opportunity she had been seeking for millennia. The salvation Gaia offered came with a price that would reshape the cosmic order itself. She revealed to the dying warrior the true history of divine rule, the endless cycle of sons overthrowing fathers that had defined cosmic politics since the beginning of time. Uranus had been overthrown by Kronos. Kronos had been overthrown by Zeus. And now, according to prophecies as old as creation itself, Zeus would be overthrown by one of his own children, or by someone who had been transformed into the equivalent of his offspring through divine power. The journey through the underworld that followed Kratos' resurrection served as both a test of his resolve and a revelation of the true stakes involved in the coming conflict. Hades' domain, which had once seemed like the ultimate expression of divine power over mortal destiny, was revealed to be just another prison designed to maintain Zeus's authority over the cosmic order. The souls trapped there were not being judged according to some universal standard of justice, but were being punished or rewarded based solely on their usefulness to Olympian interests. When Kratos encountered the Titans imprisoned in the deepest levels of Tartarus, he found beings whose power dwarfed even his enhanced abilities, but who had been chained and tormented for so long that their rage had been refined to an absolute purity that matched his own. These were not the defeated remnants of a lost cause, but cosmic forces whose time had come again, whose understanding of divine weakness had been perfected through eons of imprisonment and humiliation at Olympian hands. The alliance forged between Kratos and the Titans represented something unprecedented in cosmic history. Previous wars between divine generations had been family conflicts, struggles between related beings who shared fundamental assumptions about the nature of power and authority. Zeus's response to these developments revealed the depth of his transformation from liberator to tyrant. Rather than examining his own actions to understand why they had generated such opposition, rather than considering whether his rule might need reform to remain legitimate, the king of gods doubled down on the very behaviors that had created his enemies. His paranoia intensified to levels that made his father Kronos seem reasonable by comparison. His willingness to sacrifice anyone and anything to maintain power reached heights that shocked even gods accustomed to divine cruelty. The first skirmishes of the coming war began not as grand battles between armies, but as targeted assassinations and strategic sabotage carried out by Kratos and his Titan allies. Divine servants, loyal to Zeus, began disappearing or turning up dead in ways that demonstrated intimate knowledge of Olympian weaknesses. Sacred sites dedicated to the king of gods were desecrated, with a precision that spoke of careful planning and inside information. Most disturbingly for the Olympians, mortals across the ancient world began to lose faith in their divine protectors, offering prayers to older gods or simply abandoning religious practice altogether. But perhaps most ominous for the future of Olympian rule, other pantheons around the world began to take notice of Zeus's difficulties. Egyptian gods whispered among themselves about the weakness that civil war revealed in their Greek counterparts. Norse deities sharpened their weapons and considered whether the time might be right to expand their own influence into territories previously controlled by Olympian allies. The cosmic balance that had kept different mythological systems in their separate spheres began to shift as Zeus's authority was openly challenged for the first time in millennia. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not just who ruled the heavens, but what principles would govern divine authority in ages to come. Would power alone continue to determine cosmic law, or would the accumulated grievances of those who had suffered under that power finally demand their due? The millennia that preceded the war in Olympus represented the absolute pinnacle of divine civilization, an age when the Olympian pantheon commanded not just the Greek world, but influenced every corner of mortal existence. With their combined might, Mount Olympus itself stood as the ultimate expression of cosmic perfection, its golden halls stretching beyond the boundaries of physical space to encompass realms where pure thought took material form and divine will shaped reality, according to principles of beauty and power that mortals could barely comprehend. Zeus ruled from his throne of crystallized lightning. Each decision he made, rippling through the fabric of creation to alter the fundamental laws that governed everything, from the motion of celestial bodies to the sprouting of seeds in mortal gardens. His authority was not merely political, but ontological, woven into the very structure of existence so thoroughly that to question his will was to question the basic principles that kept the universe from collapsing back into primordial chaos. The other Olympians arranged themselves around this central figure, like planets orbiting a star, each drawing power from proximity to the king of gods, while simultaneously adding their own divine essence to the collective might of the pantheon. Hades ruled the underworld from a throne carved from a single massive diamond, his kingdom extending through caverns that honeycombed the earth's depths like a vast neural network, connecting every graveyard, every battlefield, every place where mortal life had ended in service to the cosmic order. His authority over death was absolute, encompassing not just the moment of transition from life to afterlife, but the entire process by which mortal souls were judged, sorted, and assigned their eternal fates. The rivers of the underworld flowed according to his will, carrying memories, dreams, and the accumulated wisdom of every human who had ever lived. Among the younger generation of Olympians, Athena embodied the principle of wisdom in warfare, her strategies encompassing campaigns that spanned centuries, and her tactical innovations reshaping the very nature of conflict throughout the mortal world. Her birth from Zeus's head had been more than mere divine biology. It represented the perfect fusion of raw power with intellectual sophistication, creating a goddess whose understanding of cosmic principles allowed her to predict and manipulate events with a precision that even her father found occasionally unsettling. Ares represented the opposite pole of warfare, the pure expression of violence and bloodshed that made conflict possible in the first place. While Athena planned and strategized, Ares simply existed as the embodiment of every soldier's rage, every general's willingness to sacrifice lives for victory, every moment when rational thought gave way to the primal fury that had driven mortal combat since the first human learned to make tools that could kill. His presence on any battlefield guaranteed that the fighting would escalate beyond all reasonable limits, that mercy would be forgotten in favor of total destruction. Apollo brought light and prophecy to the divine hierarchy. His oracle at Delphi serving as the primary channel through which divine will was communicated to mortal rulers. His predictions shaped the rise and fall of empires, guided the foundation of cities, and warned of disasters that could be avoided through proper worship and sacrifice. But prophecy was a double-edged gift, and Apollo's visions often revealed truths that even the gods preferred to ignore, creating tensions within Olympus that would eventually contribute to its downfall. Artemis governed the wild places that civilization had not yet claimed, her hunts ranging across forests where ancient magic still held sway, and her protection extending to every creature that lived according to natural law rather than divine command. Her independence from the political machinations that consumed most of her relatives made her both valuable as an ally and dangerous as an enemy, since her loyalty could never be assumed to follow traditional family lines. Aphrodite wielded power over love and desire, forces that could topple kingdoms and reshape the loyalty patterns that held divine society together. Her influence extended far beyond simple romantic attraction to encompass every form of emotional bond that connected one being to another, making her perhaps the most subtly powerful member of the entire pantheon. Perhaps most significantly, the Olympians' treatment of mortals began to reflect their internal dysfunction. Where once divine intervention in human affairs had been guided by principles of justice and cosmic balance, it increasingly became arbitrary and cruel, driven more by divine amusement or petty personal grievances than by any consistent moral framework. Mortals who had once viewed the gods as stern, but ultimately benevolent protectors, began to see them as capricious tyrants, whose favor could never be earned through good behavior, and whose wrath could fall upon the innocent as easily as the guilty. The seeds of rebellion were being planted, not just among mortals who suffered under divine rule, but among the gods themselves. Younger Olympians chafed under Zeus's increasingly restrictive oversight. Hidden beneath the surface of daily divine politics, ancient grievances continued to fester and grow. Gaia had never forgiven Zeus for the imprisonment of her Titan children, and her patient planning for revenge had been refined over millennia into something approaching cosmic art. The primordial forces that predated Olympian rule watched and waited for signs that Zeus's authority was weakening enough to make a successful challenge possible. And in the depths of Tartarus, imprisoned Titans dreamed of freedom and nursed their hatred into a burning desire for vengeance that would eventually find its perfect instrument in a Spartan warrior whose rage matched their own. The expansion of Olympian authority beyond the borders of Greece represented more than mere territorial conquest. It was the systematic imposition of a divine philosophy that treated mortal civilizations as resources to be harvested rather than peoples to be protected. As Greek merchants and soldiers carried their gods to distant shores, they brought with them a worldview that placed divine convenience above mortal welfare and cosmic stability above individual justice. This expansion would ultimately create the network of grievances and enemies that would provide fuel for the war that destroyed Olympus itself. Zeus's vision of divine rule extended far beyond the Mediterranean basin to encompass every corner of the world, where mortal consciousness had developed enough sophistication to comprehend divine authority. His agents, both mortal and divine, carried Olympian influence into lands where other pantheons had established their own systems of cosmic governance, creating friction that would eventually escalate into conflicts spanning multiple mythological frameworks. The king of gods viewed this expansion not as aggression, but as the natural expression of superior divine power, bringing order to regions that had previously suffered under inferior spiritual guidance. The process of Olympian expansion followed patterns that would be repeated countless times across centuries of divine imperialism. Local deities were either absorbed into the Greek pantheon as minor figures, or demonized as evil forces that needed to be defeated for the good of mortal civilization. Sacred sites dedicated to indigenous gods were claimed for Olympian worship, their altars consecrated to Zeus or his family members regardless of the cultural significance these places held for their original worshippers. Mortal rulers who embraced Greek divine authority were rewarded with military support and economic prosperity, while those who resisted found their kingdoms plagued by natural disasters and divine retribution. Poseidon's role in this expansion proved particularly devastating for coastal civilizations that had developed their own relationships with sea gods from different mythological traditions. His claim to absolute authority over all oceanic domains brought him into direct conflict with Egyptian deities who governed the Nile's floods, Celtic gods who commanded Atlantic storms, and countless local spirits whose power over harbors and fishing grounds had been recognized for millennia before Greek ships ever appeared on distant horizons. Each of these conflicts weakened the fabric of divine cooperation that had previously maintained cosmic stability across different cultural regions. The imposition of Greek divine law on foreign territories created paradoxes that revealed fundamental flaws in Olympian philosophy. Mortals who had lived for generations according to religious principles that emphasized harmony with natural forces found themselves forced to worship gods whose primary concerns seemed to be maintaining hierarchical authority and demanding constant validation through sacrifice and prayer. Cultural practices that had sustained entire civilizations for centuries were denounced as primitive superstitions that needed to be replaced with proper Greek religious observance. Athena's influence on this expansion manifested through the strategic transformation of local wisdom traditions into versions compatible with Olympian authority. Libraries and schools in conquered territories were gradually purged of texts that presented alternative views of divine nature or cosmic order. The resistance that emerged in response to this cultural and spiritual imperialism took forms that the Olympians were ill-equipped to handle. Unlike the straightforward military challenges they had faced during their rise to power, opposition to Greek divine authority often manifested as subtle subversion that worked through existing social and religious networks rather than open rebellion. Local priests maintained secret practices that honored pre-Olympian deities. Merchants spread stories that questioned Greek divine legitimacy. Scholars preserved forbidden texts that offered alternative interpretations of cosmic law. Perhaps most dangerously for long-term Olympian stability, this expansion created networks of communication between different resistance movements across the known world. Egyptian priests shared techniques for protecting sacred sites from Greek divine influence. Celtic druids exchanged information about rituals that could shield communities from Olympian surveillance. Persian mages collaborated on magical practices that could neutralize Greek divine intervention in local affairs. These networks would eventually provide the infrastructure through which news of Olympian weakness could spread rapidly once Kratos began his campaign of divine assassination. The economic exploitation that accompanied divine expansion created additional sources of resentment that would fuel future conflicts. Ares found particular satisfaction in the military campaigns that enforced Olympian expansion, viewing each conquest as validation of Greek divine superiority over inferior spiritual systems. His influence transformed conflicts that might have been resolved through negotiation into wars of extermination that left vast regions depopulated and culturally devastated. The god of war encouraged Greek generals to view foreign resistance not as legitimate defense of homeland, but as rebellious defiance of cosmic order that needed to be crushed with maximum brutality. But the most insidious aspect of Olympian expansion was its effect on the gods themselves. Success in dominating foreign territories fed their already dangerous tendency toward hubris and paranoia. Each victory convinced them that their authority was truly universal and unquestionable. Each act of resistance they crushed reinforced their belief that opposition to their rule was inherently evil and deserving of severe punishment. They became increasingly isolated from the real consequences of their actions, surrounded by worshippers who told them only what they wanted to hear while genuine criticism was systematically suppressed. The divine family dynamics, that had always been problematic within Olympus, became exponentially more dangerous when amplified across a global scale. Zeus's paranoia about potential threats to his authority led him to establish surveillance networks that monitored divine activity in every corner of the expanding Greek sphere of influence. His children found themselves competing not just for his approval, but for control over newly acquired territories that represented unprecedented opportunities for accumulating personal power and influence. As reports of Olympian weakness began to circulate through the resistance networks established during their expansion, other major pantheons started to reconsider their previously cautious relationships with Greek divine authority. Norse gods began to probe the northern boundaries of Greek influence, testing whether Olympian responses to border incidents were as swift and decisive as they had been in previous centuries. Egyptian deities started providing more open support to local resistance movements, calculating that Greek divine retaliation might no longer be inevitable or insurmountable. The stage was being set for a conflict that would span multiple mythological systems and involve cosmic forces that the Olympians had dismissed as irrelevant to their supposedly superior form of divine governance. The empire they had built through centuries of expansion had created the very networks that would carry news of their vulnerability to every corner of the known world, ensuring that when their reign finally collapsed, the reverberations would be felt across every civilization that had suffered under their supposedly benevolent divine protection. The first signs that Olympian authority might not be as absolute as the gods claimed emerged not through dramatic confrontations or open rebellion, but through the gradual accumulation of small failures that revealed fundamental weaknesses in their cosmic governance. Divine promises that went unfulfilled, prophecies that proved inaccurate, and interventions that produced results opposite to their intended effects began to undermine the aura of infallibility that had sustained Olympian rule for millennia. The divine oath-breaking, that had once been a rarely invoked nuclear option in cosmic politics, became so commonplace that mortals began to lose faith in any promise made by Olympian gods. Zeus himself violated sacred agreements whenever they became inconvenient, setting an example that his children followed with increasing frequency and brazenness. Treaties between gods that had maintained stability for centuries were abandoned without warning or explanation when they conflicted with short-term political advantages. Poseidon's control over the seas began to manifest unpredictable anomalies that disrupted trade routes and threatened coastal civilizations with unprecedented natural disasters. Storms arose without meteorological cause in regions where his authority should have guaranteed calm waters. Sea creatures behaved in ways that violated their established nature, with peaceful species becoming aggressive and predatory animals, abandoning their hunting grounds for reasons that defied divine understanding. The god of earthquakes found his own powers, producing tremors that struck randomly, rather than targeting specific enemies of Olympian authority. Hades discovered that souls were escaping from his underworld domain through mechanisms that should not have existed, returning to haunt the living world with knowledge of divine secrets that were meant to remain hidden. The rivers that carried the dead to their final judgment began flowing in reverse, depositing ancient memories and forgotten grievances in places where they could influence current events. The careful system of posthumous rewards and punishments that had kept mortal behavior aligned with divine preferences started producing results that seemed almost deliberately contrary to Olympian interests. The younger gods found their own abilities becoming unreliable in ways that suggested some external force was interfering with the fundamental principles that governed divine power. Athena's strategic insights became clouded with possibilities she could not fully analyze, her usually perfect tactical calculations producing recommendations that led to unexpected defeats and diplomatic disasters. Her attempts to maintain wisdom and reason within Olympian decision-making processes were increasingly overruled by her father's paranoid impulses and her siblings' growing desperation to maintain their individual spheres of influence. Mogris experienced the most troubling manifestations of divine dysfunction, as conflicts he instigated began resolving themselves through peaceful means, despite his direct intervention to promote violence and bloodshed. Armies he had blessed with divine fury found themselves laying down weapons and negotiating treaties, instead of fighting to the death. Warriors who should have been consumed with battle rage instead began questioning the purposes they were fighting for and abandoning military campaigns that had previously seemed inevitable. Artemis watched her wild domains, shrinking as mortal civilizations expanded into regions that should have remained under her protection. The animals she governed began exhibiting behaviors that suggested they were no longer responding to her influence, migrating in patterns that defied both natural instinct and divine command. The independence she had always maintained from Olympian politics became a liability, as she found herself unable to call upon family support when her authority was challenged by forces she could not identify or understand. Aphrodite's power over love and desire produced increasingly chaotic results, as mortals began forming emotional bonds that transcended the simple patterns she had always been able to manipulate with ease. Romantic relationships that should have served Olympian political purposes instead created alliances between groups that had previously been enemies. The social structures that depended on predictable attraction and loyalty started evolving in directions that weakened rather than strengthened divine influence over mortal civilization. Hephaestus found his divine craftsmanship producing artifacts with properties he had not intended to include, weapons that turned against their wielders and tools that served purposes opposite to their designed functions. The forges that had always responded perfectly to his will began creating items that seemed to possess their own agenda, spreading influence that undermined rather than supported Olympian authority. His role as the provider of divine implements became a source of weakness rather than strength, as gods found themselves unable to trust the reliability of their most essential tools. The prophetic warnings that had been accumulating for centuries began manifesting with increasing clarity and urgency. Mortal seers across the Greek world reported visions of burning temples and falling gods that were too consistent to dismiss as mere hallucinations or propaganda from Olympian enemies. Sacred texts discovered in ancient ruins contained predictions that aligned disturbingly well with current events, suggesting that the forces gathering against Olympian rule had been preparing their assault for far longer than anyone had realized. Most disturbing for the long-term stability of divine rule, these failures began attracting attention from cosmic forces that the Olympians had assumed were either defeated or safely contained. Gaia's subtle influence became detectable in natural phenomena that should have remained under Olympian control. Earthquakes struck in patterns that seemed designed to spell out messages of defiance against Zeus's authority. Volcanic eruptions deposited ash in formations that resembled ancient symbols of rebellion and cosmic justice. The Titans imprisoned in Tartarus began communicating with the outside world through methods that bypassed all divine security measures designed to keep them isolated. Their whispered promises of freedom and revenge reached mortals who had never heard of the ancient war between divine generations, inspiring resistance movements that drew upon sources of power older than Olympian civilization. These communications revealed that the supposedly defeated Titans had spent their imprisonment developing new forms of cosmic influence that could operate beyond the reach of Zeus's surveillance. The network of alliances that had sustained Olympian expansion began showing signs of strain as foreign pantheons reconsidered their relationships with Greek divine authority. Egyptian gods started providing less cooperation in matters of mutual cosmic concern. Norse deities became less responsive to requests for assistance in maintaining order along their shared borders. Even minor local spirits that had previously acknowledged Olympian supremacy began asserting independence in ways that suggested they were receiving support from hidden sources. The divine family meetings that had once been occasions for coordinated planning and shared celebration became exercises in mutual recrimination and barely contained hostility. Gods who had worked together for millennia found themselves unable to trust each other's motivations or rely on each other's support. Zeus's attempts to maintain unity through increasingly authoritarian control only accelerated the breakdown of cooperation that had made their collective rule effective. As these cracks in divine authority widened and multiplied, the stage was being set for challenges that would test whether Olympian power was truly eternal, or merely another phase in the cosmic cycle of rise and fall that had claimed every previous divine dynasty. The accumulated failures and contradictions that had been building for centuries were approaching a critical mass that would soon require either fundamental reform or catastrophic collapse. The resurrection of Kratos from the depths of Hades marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare that no pantheon had ever faced, a conflict where divine immortality became a weakness rather than an advantage. When the ghost of Sparta emerged from the underworld with the backing of beings older than Olympus itself, he brought with him not just personal rage, but the accumulated grievances of every mortal who had ever suffered under divine indifference and the cosmic authority of primordial forces that predated Zeus's rule by eons. Gaia's alliance with the former god of war represented more than simple political convenience. It was the fusion of ancient wisdom with focused fury, creating a strategic partnership that combined the Earth Mother's intimate knowledge of Olympian weaknesses with Kratos' proven ability to kill immortal beings. The Titans who had languished in Tartarus for millennia provided both the raw power necessary to challenge gods directly and the tactical insights that could only come from having once ruled the cosmos themselves. The first divine casualty fell not in some grand confrontation, but through methodical hunting that demonstrated how completely the nature of divine warfare had changed. Kratos tracked his prey through realms where gods had never before needed to fear for their safety, using techniques that combined mortal cunning with supernatural endurance to create a form of predation that divine minds struggled to comprehend or counter effectively. Helios, the god who carried the sun across the sky each day, became the first Olympian to discover that divine duties that had once been sources of power could become fatal vulnerabilities when faced by an enemy who understood how to exploit the rigid patterns that governed cosmic functions. The Titan-backed assault on the Sun Chariot represented a new form of divine terrorism, targeting not just individual gods, but the fundamental services they provided to maintain cosmic order. The psychological impact of Helios's death rippled through Olympus like a shockwave that shattered millennia of divine confidence. Gods who had never questioned their own immortality found themselves confronting the terrifying possibility that death was not just theoretical, but immediate and personal. The golden halls that had once echoed with celebration and divine laughter became filled with paranoid whispers and desperate attempts to understand how their supposedly inferior enemies had acquired the power to end immortal existence permanently. Zeus's response to this first divine assassination revealed the depths of his transformation from liberator to tyrant. Rather than examining his own actions to understand why they had generated such opposition, the king of gods implemented security measures that treated his own family as potential threats. Divine surveillance networks that had been designed to monitor mortal populations were turned inward to watch for signs of disloyalty among the Olympians themselves. Poseidon's death followed a pattern that demonstrated the systematic nature of Kratos' campaign against divine authority. The god of seas and earthquakes fell not through direct confrontation, but through the exploitation of cosmic laws that he himself had helped establish. The irony was lost on none of the surviving Olympians. Their own divine principles were being used as weapons against them by enemies who understood the fundamental rules of cosmic governance better than those who supposedly ruled according to those principles. The manner of each divine death sent specific messages to the surviving gods about the futility of resistance and the inevitability of justice for their crimes against mortal civilization. Hades discovered that his domain over death provided no protection against an enemy who had already died and returned stronger than before. The Lord of the Underworld's demise in his own realm served as proof that no sanctuary existed where Olympian gods could hide from the consequences of their actions. Hera's assassination struck at the heart of divine family structures that had maintained Olympian society for millennia. The Queen of Gods fell victim to the same domestic dysfunction that she had helped perpetuate through centuries of bitter rivalry and petty vengeance against Zeus's various lovers and illegitimate children. The systematic elimination of divine communication networks left the surviving Olympians increasingly isolated and paranoid, unable to coordinate their responses or share information about enemy movements. Hermes, whose role as divine messenger had made him essential to Olympian governance, became a target precisely because his death would fragment the pantheon's ability to function as a coordinated political entity. Each successful assassination proved that divine power alone was insufficient protection against enemies who combined supernatural abilities with strategic intelligence and absolute moral certainty about the justice of their cause. The divine panic that spread through Olympus manifested in increasingly desperate and counterproductive measures designed to restore the sense of invulnerability that had sustained Olympian confidence for millennia. Gods who had never bothered to learn defensive combat techniques found themselves attempting to master arts of war that their enemies had been perfecting for lifetimes. Divine artifacts that had been stored as ceremonial trophies were hastily retrieved and prepared for actual use in conflicts their creators had never imagined. The breakdown of divine cooperation, accelerated as individual gods prioritized personal survival over collective resistance to the Titan-backed assault. Alliances that had seemed eternal dissolved when faced with the possibility of genuine divine death. Gods who had worked together for centuries began viewing each other as potential sources of information that enemies might extract through torture or magical compulsion. Athena's attempts to organize systematic resistance revealed how completely the nature of divine conflict had changed since the Titan War that had established Olympian supremacy. The strategic principles that had guided their victory over the previous generation of cosmic rulers proved useless against enemies who operated according to entirely different assumptions about the purposes of divine power and the legitimate limits of cosmic authority. The revelation that divine death was not only possible, but increasingly common, transformed Olympian society in ways that went far beyond simple military concerns. Gods who had made enemies over millennia of arrogant behavior found themselves wondering whether past victims might now possess the power to claim vengeance. Divine social hierarchies that had been based on relative power levels became meaningless when any god might be the next target for elimination. The mortal world's response to news of divine deaths created additional complications for the surviving Olympians. Populations that had worshipped Greek gods out of fear rather than genuine devotion began abandoning their religious obligations entirely, calculating that gods who could be killed were not worthy of continued reverence or sacrifice. Prayer and tribute that had sustained divine power for millennia began drying up precisely when that power was most needed for defense against external threats. The cosmic balance that had maintained stability between different pantheons started shifting as other divine systems reconsidered their relationships with increasingly vulnerable Greek gods. Egyptian deities began expanding their influence into territories that had previously been under Olympian protection. Norse gods tested the boundaries of their traditional domains, probing for signs that Greek divine authority was no longer capable of enforcing established cosmic borders. As the circle of surviving Olympians grew smaller, and their desperation more apparent, the stage was set for even more extreme measures that would push divine behavior beyond all previous boundaries of acceptable cosmic conduct. The gods who had once claimed to represent order and justice were about to discover how quickly absolute power could transform its wielders into the very monsters they claimed to oppose. The systematic elimination of their family members drove the surviving Olympians to abandon every principle of cosmic governance that had supposedly distinguished their rule from the tyrannical regimes they had overthrown. Zeus, faced with the undeniable reality that his pantheon was being methodically destroyed by forces he could neither understand nor control, made the fateful decision to unleash powers that should never have been disturbed, opening pathways to cosmic destruction that would make the original Titan War seem like a minor diplomatic disagreement. The first desperate measure involved the violation of the most sacred taboo in divine politics, the deliberate weakening of the barriers that contained primordial chaos. Zeus calculated that if he could not defeat his enemies through conventional divine power, he might succeed by threatening to unmake creation itself, unless they abandoned their campaign of vengeance. The king of gods began systematically dismantling cosmic safeguards that had been established at enormous cost during the early ages of divine rule, gambling that his enemies cared more about preserving the universe than about completing their revenge. Pandora's box, which had been sealed and hidden precisely because its contents represented existential threats to organized reality, was retrieved from its cosmic vault and weaponized in ways that its original creators had never intended. The release of hope, fear, disease, and other abstract forces into the physical world created cascading disruptions that affected not just the immediate battlefield, but the fundamental principles governing mortal existence across every realm touched by Olympian influence. The decision to ally with beings they had previously considered enemies revealed how completely desperation had corrupted Olympian judgment. Zeus approached entities that had been imprisoned or banished during his rise to power, offering pardons and restored authority in exchange for assistance against the Titan-backed rebellion. These negotiations required abandoning moral positions that had served as justifications for Olympian rule, acknowledging that their supposed superiority over previous divine regimes had been based more on propaganda than genuine ethical advancement. The Furies, ancient embodiments of vengeance who had been bound to serve Olympian justice, were released from their constraints and given free rein to pursue retribution against anyone who opposed Zeus's authority. This decision transformed cosmic law enforcement from a systematic application of divine justice into arbitrary punishment driven by paranoid rage. The creatures that emerged from their ancient prisons bore little resemblance to the controlled instruments of divine will they had once been, having been twisted by eons of forced servitude into beings whose concept of justice aligned perfectly with Zeus's increasingly tyrannical worldview. The resurrection of divine beings, who had been deliberately eliminated during previous conflicts, demonstrated the extent to which cosmic law had broken down under pressure from the war. Gods who had been killed for rebellion against Olympian authority were restored to existence and granted pardons in exchange for military service against Kratos and his Titan allies. These revenants brought with them not just supernatural power, but intimate knowledge of Olympian weaknesses gained during their previous conflicts with Zeus's regime. The magical experimentation that followed these initial desperate measures pushed divine science into territories that had been explicitly forbidden since the establishment of cosmic order. Olympian artificers began creating weapons that drew power directly from the life force of mortal populations, transforming entire civilizations into batteries for divine war machines. The ethical constraints that had previously limited such research were abandoned as Zeus declared that any measure was justified if it contributed to Olympian survival. The attempt to drain power from rival pantheons represented perhaps the most dangerous escalation in divine warfare since the primordial conflicts that had shaped the fundamental structure of reality. Zeus authorized attacks on the cosmic foundations that maintained separation between different mythological systems, seeking to steal divine essence from Egyptian, Norse, and other pantheons, to supplement his own diminishing resources. These assaults created interdimensional instabilities that threatened to collapse the barriers between incompatible forms of divine reality. The sacrifice of mortal worshippers on an unprecedented scale revealed how completely the Olympians had abandoned any pretense of benevolent divine guardianship. Entire cities were consumed in rituals designed to channel their population's life energy into cosmic weapons capable of harming Titan-level beings. The gods who had once claimed to protect human civilization began treating mortals as disposable resources whose only value lay in their potential contribution to divine military capabilities. The corruption of natural law accelerated as desperate Olympians began overriding fundamental cosmic principles to gain temporary tactical advantages. Gravity, time, causality, and other basic forces were manipulated in ways that created reality storms affecting vast regions of the mortal world. The careful balance between order and chaos that had sustained civilized existence for millennia began collapsing under the strain of divine powers being pushed far beyond their intended limits. The development of god-killing weapons represented the final abandonment of divine ethics in favor of pure survival instinct. Hephaestus was forced to create artifacts specifically designed to permanently eliminate immortal beings, violating his own nature as a creator deity, to become an instrument of cosmic destruction. The forges that had once produced marvels of divine artistry began churning out implements of deicide, whose very existence posed threats to every pantheon in creation. The alliance with abstract concepts that had previously been kept carefully contained demonstrated how far Zeus was willing to go to maintain power. Fear, hatred, despair, and other emotional forces were given physical form and granted divine authority to act against Olympian enemies. These entities, unbound by the moral constraints that had traditionally limited divine behavior, began operations that treated both enemy combatants and innocent bystanders as equally valid targets for elimination. The temporal manipulations that followed represented attempts to retroactively prevent the rebellion by altering past events that had led to current disasters. Divine chronomancers, working under Zeus's direct orders, began targeting the historical foundations of Titan resistance, seeking to erase key moments that had enabled their enemies to gain sufficient power to threaten Olympian rule. These interventions created temporal paradoxes that threatened to unravel the causal structure underlying organized reality. The psychological warfare techniques developed during this period pushed divine conflict into realms that previous generations of cosmic rulers had considered too dangerous to explore. Olympian specialists began creating mental viruses designed to spread through divine consciousness networks, seeking to drive enemy leaders insane rather than simply killing them. The infection of divine minds with artificially constructed madness created contamination risks that extended far beyond the immediate targets. The final desperate measure involved the complete militarization of Olympian society, transforming every aspect of divine civilization into instruments of war against the Titan-backed rebellion. Art, music, philosophy, and other cultural achievements that had defined the golden age of Greek divine rule were abandoned or perverted into propaganda tools designed to maintain morale among increasingly desperate defenders. As these measures failed to produce the decisive victory that Zeus had promised, the surviving Olympians began to understand that their desperate gambles had not just failed to save their regime, but had accelerated its transformation into something that bore no resemblance to the cosmic order they had originally sought to protect. The cure had become worse than the disease, and the forces they had unleashed to defeat their enemies were now beyond their ability to control or contain. The moment when Zeus made the calculated decision to sacrifice his own family to preserve his personal authority marked the final transformation of Olympian civilization from a cosmic government into a paranoid dictatorship, willing to destroy everything it claimed to protect. The king of gods, faced with the undeniable reality that conventional resistance had failed to stop Kratos' methodical elimination of the pantheon, chose to implement a strategy so fundamentally evil that it shattered the last vestiges of moral legitimacy that had sustained divine rule for millennia. The betrayal began with Athena, the goddess whose wisdom and loyalty had made her Zeus's most trusted advisor throughout the crisis. Her father's secret plan required eliminating not just obvious threats to his authority, but anyone whose moral standards might prevent them from accepting the measures he deemed necessary for Olympian survival. Athena's assassination was orchestrated to appear like enemy action, while actually being carried out by agents operating under Zeus's direct orders, creating the first crack in divine unity that would rapidly expand into complete familial warfare. The systematic elimination of his own children revealed the depths of paranoia that had consumed Zeus's divine mind during the prolonged conflict with Titan-backed forces. Each family member who had ever questioned his decisions, expressed sympathy for enemy positions, or demonstrated independent moral judgment became a potential security threat, requiring immediate elimination. The King of Gods had concluded that loyalty could only be guaranteed through fear, and that the most reliable way to generate such fear was through demonstrating his willingness to kill even those closest to him. Apollo's death came next. The god of prophecy eliminated specifically because his visions had begun revealing truths that Zeus preferred to keep hidden from other Olympians. The sun god's attempts to warn his family about their father's increasingly tyrannical behavior were silenced through poison that corrupted his divine essence from within. The corruption of divine family bonds accelerated as surviving Olympians began to realize that their greatest threat came not from external enemies, but from the paranoid ruler they had served faithfully for millennia. Gods who had never questioned Zeus's authority found themselves forced to choose between personal survival and family loyalty, with the growing understanding that neutrality was no longer an option in a conflict where the King of Gods viewed anyone not actively supporting his most extreme measures as potential traitors. Artemis discovered her father's true nature when she refused to participate in operations that involved the systematic slaughter of mortal populations for strategic advantage. Her independence, which had once been tolerated as harmless eccentricity, became viewed as dangerous dissent that might inspire other gods to question orders they found morally objectionable. The goddess of the hunt became prey in her own domains, pursued by divine assassins who had been promised rewards for eliminating family members who demonstrated insufficient loyalty to Zeus's increasingly desperate regime. The revelation that Hephaestus had been forced to create weapons specifically designed to kill his own siblings shattered the last illusions about divine nobility that had sustained Olympian society through previous crises. The god of forge and fire, traditionally the most gentle and cooperative member of the pantheon, had been transformed into an unwilling instrument of familial genocide through threats that targeted not just him, but every mortal craftsman who had ever honored his teachings. Aphrodite's betrayal by her own father involved the corruption of her fundamental nature as goddess of love and beauty. Zeus's agents poisoned her divine essence with concentrated hatred and discord, transforming her from a source of harmony into a weapon of psychological warfare designed to spread suspicion and paranoia among enemy forces. The violation of her core identity represented not just personal assault, but an attack on the cosmic principles she embodied, creating instabilities in mortal emotional life that would persist long after the war's conclusion. The divine communication networks that had once coordinated Olympian responses to external threats were systematically compromised as Zeus implemented surveillance systems designed to monitor his own family for signs of disloyalty or rebellion. Gods found themselves unable to speak freely, even in supposedly private conversations, knowing that any expression of doubt about official policies might be interpreted as treasonous conspiracy requiring immediate elimination. The psychological impact of discovering that their supposed protector had become their greatest threat created a form of divine trauma that no previous conflict had ever produced. Gods who had existed for millennia without questioning their fundamental assumptions about cosmic order, found themselves forced to reconsider everything they had believed about divine nature, family bonds, and the moral foundations of their civilization. The alliance between Zeus and abstract forces of corruption represented the final abandonment of any pretense that Olympian rule served purposes beyond personal power preservation. Entities representing fear, hatred, despair, and other negative emotions were granted divine authority and encouraged to operate against both external enemies and internal dissidents without regard for traditional limitations on cosmic intervention in mortal affairs. The moment when surviving Olympians realized that their king would rather rule over ruins than accept any limitation on his authority marked the point at which divine civil war became inevitable. Gods who had remained loyal despite mounting evidence of Zeus's moral corruption finally understood that their choice was not between victory and defeat, but between complicity in cosmic atrocities and resistance that might cost them their immortal existence. The discovery that Zeus had been secretly negotiating with Kratos' enemies while publicly demanding family unity in the face of external threats revealed the extent to which divine leadership had been corrupted by paranoid calculation. The king of gods had been preparing to sacrifice the entire pantheon to preserve his personal survival, viewing his own family as acceptable losses in a conflict where only his continued rule mattered. The breakdown of divine justice systems accelerated as Zeus began using accusations of treason to eliminate anyone who questioned his increasingly extreme measures. The careful legal procedures that had governed Olympian society for millennia were abandoned in favor of summary executions based on nothing more than the king's paranoid suspicions about potential threats to his authority. The corruption of divine memory became another weapon in Zeus's arsenal of family destruction. As he began altering the historical records that defined Olympian identity and purpose, gods found their own memories of past events being systematically rewritten to support versions of cosmic history that justified current atrocities while eliminating evidence of alternative approaches to divine governance that might inspire resistance to authoritarian rule. The final revelation that Zeus had been planning the complete elimination of his own pantheon as the ultimate solution to external threats destroyed any remaining possibility of family reconciliation or internal reform. The king of gods had concluded that ruling over empty divine realms was preferable to sharing authority with family members who might eventually challenge his decisions, making the coming confrontation not just inevitable, but necessary for the survival of anyone who retained any vestige of moral conscience. As the scope of divine betrayal became impossible to deny or rationalize, the stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether cosmic authority would continue to be exercised according to principles of paranoid tyranny, or whether new forms of divine governance might emerge from the ashes of a pantheon that had sacrificed everything noble about itself in pursuit of power without purpose or limitation. The collapse of Mount Olympus, as both physical location and symbol of divine authority, began with structural failures that reflected the complete breakdown of cosmic order that had sustained the pantheon for millennia. The golden halls that had once defied natural law through pure divine will started obeying mundane physics as the gods who maintained them through constant application of supernatural power fell one by one to Kratos' relentless campaign of divine assassination. The marble columns that had supported throne rooms, larger than mortal cities, began developing stress fractures that spread like infection through the divine architecture. Each crack represented not just physical deterioration, but the failure of cosmic principles that had been woven into the very foundations of Olympian civilization. As the gods who embodied concepts like structural integrity, artistic perfection, and architectural harmony were eliminated, their domains began reverting to the chaos that had existed before divine intervention imposed order upon raw matter. Zeus's throne room, the symbolic center of cosmic authority, experienced the most dramatic manifestations of divine realm collapse. The crystallized lightning that had formed his seat of power began losing coherence, its carefully shaped electrical patterns dissolving into random discharges that struck without warning or purpose. The king of gods found himself ruling from a position that physically demonstrated his loss of control over the forces he claimed to command, his every pronouncement accompanied by unpredictable displays of power that served only to highlight his inability to maintain even basic divine functions. The gardens of Olympus, where divine contemplation had once maintained perfect seasonal cycles and supernatural beauty that inspired mortal art across the ancient world, withered into landscapes that reflected the psychological state of their dying creators. Flowers that had bloomed eternally began rotting while still attached to their stems. Trees that had provided shade for divine counsels twisted into shapes that suggested pain and despair rather than natural growth. The very soil became toxic to divine essence, poisoning any god who attempted to rest in places that had once restored their spiritual strength. The divine communication networks that had coordinated Olympian responses to cosmic crises for millennia collapsed as the gods responsible for maintaining ethereal infrastructure were systematically eliminated by enemies who understood exactly which targets would cause maximum systemic damage. Messages sent between surviving pantheon members arrived garbled or reversed, their content transformed into threats and accusations that accelerated the breakdown of trust between gods who needed cooperation more desperately than ever before. The mortal world experienced the consequences of divine realm collapse through natural disasters that exceeded anything recorded in human history. The death of gods responsible for maintaining seasonal cycles caused simultaneous droughts and floods in the same geographical regions. The elimination of deities who controlled tectonic stability triggered earthquake swarms that continued for months without following any recognizable pattern. The corruption of divine beings who governed atmospheric phenomena created weather systems that defied meteorological explanation while devastating entire civilizations. Poseidon's death had left the world's oceans without divine guidance, transforming them from controlled systems that supported mortal navigation and trade into chaotic forces that seemed actively hostile to human survival. Tsunamis struck coastlines with no seismic trigger. Whirlpools appeared in previously calm waters, swallowing ships whose crews had committed no offense against divine law. The very temperature of seawater began fluctuating in ways that killed marine life on a scale that threatened the entire oceanic ecosystem. The underworld's infrastructure collapsed, as Hades' death eliminated the divine authority that had maintained order among the countless souls trapped in posthumous existence. Spirits that had been confined to specific regions of the afterlife began wandering freely through realms where they had no legitimate business. The rivers that had carried souls to their appointed destinations started flowing upward, depositing ancient grudges and forgotten memories in the world of the living, where they influenced current events in unpredictable ways. The educational systems that had transmitted divine knowledge to mortal populations began producing graduates whose understanding of cosmic law was fundamentally corrupted by the breakdown of divine authority. Priests who had devoted their lives to serving Olympian gods found their prayers answered by entities that bore little resemblance to the deities they had been trained to worship. Oracles who had provided reliable guidance for generations began delivering prophecies that contradicted established religious doctrine while proving disturbingly accurate in their predictions of continued divine collapse. The economic networks that had sustained Mediterranean civilization through divine protection of trade routes and commercial agreements collapsed as merchants lost confidence in gods who could no longer guarantee safe passage for cargo ships or enforcement of contracts between trading partners. Cities that had prospered for centuries under Olympian patronage found themselves abandoned by their divine protectors, forcing mortal populations to develop new forms of social organization that did not depend on supernatural intervention. The military alliances that had maintained stability between Greek city-states began dissolving as local rulers recognized that divine backing for their authority was no longer reliable. Wars that had been prevented for generations through fear of divine retribution erupted simultaneously across regions that had previously been kept peaceful through Olympian threat of supernatural punishment. The collapse of divine peacekeeping created power vacuums that attracted ambitious mortals whose lack of religious restraint made them far more dangerous than previous generations of politically motivated warfare. The artistic and cultural achievements that had defined Greek civilization at its peak began deteriorating as the divine inspiration that had guided human creativity was corrupted or eliminated entirely. Sculptors found themselves unable to achieve the perfect proportions that had characterized classical art. Musicians discovered that their instruments would no longer produce the harmonious sounds that had once moved both mortal and divine audiences. Writers who had crafted epic poetry celebrating divine heroism found their words twisted into accounts of cosmic horror that no one wanted to hear or remember. The diplomatic relationships that had maintained peace between the Olympian pantheon and other divine systems collapsed as foreign gods recognized that Greek divine authority was no longer capable of honoring international agreements or providing reciprocal support in times of crisis. Egyptian deities began annexing territories that had been under Olympian protection for centuries. Norse gods started expanding their influence into regions where Greek divine law had previously been supreme. The cosmic balance that had prevented interdimensional warfare between incompatible mythological systems began breaking down as weakened Olympians could no longer maintain their traditional spheres of influence. The technological innovations that had been inspired by divine knowledge began producing results that their creators had never intended. Weapons designed for defense against mortal enemies proved capable of harming divine beings when wielded by mortals who no longer believed in Olympian invulnerability. Architectural techniques that had been gifts from Hephaestus were used to construct fortifications designed specifically to keep gods out rather than invite their presence. The tools that had once symbolized divine benevolence toward human civilization were transformed into instruments of resistance against divine authority itself. The religious festivals that had maintained spiritual connections between mortal communities and their divine patrons became occasions for expressing doubt and resentment rather than gratitude and worship. Populations that had celebrated Olympian power for generations began holding ceremonies that openly mocked divine pretensions while calling upon older, more reliable sources of supernatural protection. The transformation of worship into rebellion accelerated the breakdown of divine power systems that depended on mortal faith for their continued existence. As the spiral of collapse accelerated beyond any possibility of recovery, the surviving Olympians found themselves faced with a choice between accepting total defeat or escalating their resistance to levels that would guarantee the complete destruction of everything they had once claimed to protect. The pantheon that had once represented the pinnacle of divine civilization was about to discover that some forms of victory are indistinguishable from absolute defeat. The confrontation between Zeus and Kratos that would determine the fate of all divine authority began not with the dramatic declarations of cosmic purpose that had characterized previous wars between gods, but with the quiet recognition by both combatants that their conflict had transcended personal grievance to become a fundamental test of whether power without justice could survive when challenged by justice without mercy. The battlefield was the ruined peak of Mount Olympus itself, where the collapsed remains of golden halls and shattered divine monuments bore witness to the complete failure of the cosmic order that Zeus had claimed to represent. The king of gods stood among the rubble of his own throne room, his form crackling with electrical energy that no longer seemed magnificent but desperate, the lightning that had once symbolized absolute authority now appearing as nothing more than the death throes of a tyrant who had destroyed everything he touched in his paranoid quest to maintain power. Kratos approached through the devastation with the methodical certainty of natural law itself, his every step across the blood-soaked marble demonstrating that divine invulnerability was merely another lie that gods told themselves to avoid confronting the consequences of their actions. The blades of chaos in his hands had evolved beyond their original form as weapons of divine servitude to become instruments of cosmic justice, their flames burning with the accumulated rage of every mortal who had ever suffered under Olympian indifference. The first exchange of attacks revealed how completely the nature of divine combat had changed during the course of the war. Zeus unleashed lightning bolts that should have been capable of reducing mountains to ash, but Kratos absorbed their energy and redirected it back at his opponent with interest, demonstrating that the power the king of gods had stolen from primordial sources could be turned against him by someone who understood the fundamental principles of cosmic energy better than the tyrant who wielded it. The battle escalated through phases that systematically destroyed every remaining structure on Mount Olympus, each level of conflict reaching intensities that threatened to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. When Zeus attempted to channel the full power of his divine domain through attacks that manipulated time, space, and causality simultaneously, Kratos countered with techniques that drew upon forces older than Olympian civilization, calling upon the primordial chaos that had existed before any god learned to impose order upon the universe. The appearance of Gaia during the height of combat added a third dimension to the conflict that transformed it from a personal duel into a cosmic event with implications for every pantheon in existence. The Earth Mother's decision to intervene represented not just support for Kratos' campaign of vengeance, but the assertion of primordial authority over divine politics, a declaration that the age of Olympian rule had ended regardless of whether Zeus survived the immediate confrontation. But Gaia's betrayal of Kratos at the crucial moment revealed that even the most ancient cosmic forces were not immune to the corruption that had poisoned divine governance throughout the war. Her attempt to eliminate both Zeus and Kratos simultaneously demonstrated that primordial beings were just as capable of paranoid calculation as their Olympian successors, viewing the Spartan warrior not as an ally in the cause of cosmic justice, but as a potential threat to her own plans for resuming control over divine civilization. The three-way battle that followed pushed the limits of what Mount Olympus could contain, with combatants whose power levels exceeded the safety margins that had been built into divine realm architecture. When the mountain was first established as the center of Olympian rule, the peak itself began cracking under the strain of energies that its designers had never imagined would be unleashed in concentrated combat, creating fissures that extended down into the Earth's core, while simultaneously opening rifts in the sky that revealed glimpses of cosmic voids beyond normal space. Zeus's desperate attempt to end the conflict by threatening to destroy all creation revealed the final depths of his moral corruption. As the king of gods demonstrated his willingness to commit cosmic genocide rather than accept any limitation on his personal authority, his channeling of power, sufficient to unmake the universe, represented not strength, but the ultimate expression of divine cowardice, the choice of a tyrant who would rather rule over nothing than allow others to live according to principles he could not control. Kratos' refusal to be intimidated by threats of universal destruction demonstrated that his transformation during the course of the war had created something unprecedented in cosmic history, a being whose commitment to justice was stronger than his attachment to existence itself. His willingness to risk the complete annihilation of everything that had ever existed rather than allow Zeus to continue ruling through fear represented a form of moral courage that even the primordial forces found difficult to comprehend. The moment when hope was released from Pandora's box marked the turning point that would determine not just the outcome of the immediate battle, but the future evolution of divine governance throughout all mythological systems. The abstract force that had been imprisoned because of its potential to inspire resistance against cosmic tyranny proved to be the one power that even Zeus could not corrupt or control, creating a form of energy that strengthened those who fought for justice while weakening those who relied on fear and oppression. The final phase of combat between Zeus and Kratos took place in a realm beyond physical space, where the fundamental principles that governed reality itself became weapons that could be wielded by combatants who had transcended normal limitations of divine power. The king of gods discovered that his authority meant nothing in a space where cosmic law responded to moral legitimacy rather than raw strength, while Kratos found that his rage had been purified by suffering into something that could reshape the basic structure of existence. The aftermath of the battle revealed that Mount Olympus itself had been mortally wounded by the conflict, its divine architecture beginning a collapse that would take centuries to complete, but could not be stopped by any remaining power in the universe. The mountain that had served as the symbol of divine authority for millennia was transformed into a monument to the consequences of power exercised without wisdom, responsibility, or basic regard for the welfare of those subject to cosmic governance. Kratos stood alone among the ruins of the pantheon he had destroyed, his quest for vengeance complete, but his understanding of its cost only beginning to develop. The release of hope into the world represented not just the end of the Olympian age, but the beginning of a new era in which divine authority would be subject to moral evaluation by those it claimed to govern. The force that Zeus had feared most had proved to be the one thing capable of transforming cosmic tyranny into something that might eventually serve the interests of justice, rather than the paranoid calculations of immortal beings who had forgotten that power, without purpose, is merely organized destruction waiting for its inevitable moment of self-annihilation. The silence that descended upon the Mediterranean world, following the complete destruction of the Olympian pantheon, was unlike anything in recorded human history, a profound absence of divine presence that left mortal civilizations struggling to comprehend a universe where prayers received no answers and cosmic justice was no longer enforced by supernatural authority. The sudden elimination of beings who had shaped every aspect of existence for millennia created a void that affected not just religious practice, but the fundamental assumptions upon which human society had been constructed. The Greek city-states that had built their entire political and social structures around divine patronage found themselves adrift in a world where the gods who had legitimized their authority no longer existed to provide guidance or punishment. Rulers who had claimed to govern with divine mandate discovered that their subjects were no longer willing to accept supernatural justification for political decisions, forcing the development of new forms of governance based on human consent rather than cosmic appointment. The collapse of divine communication networks left mortal populations without the prophetic guidance that had shaped major decisions for centuries. The oracle at Delphi fell silent permanently, its sacred vapors no longer carrying visions from Apollo, but instead producing only toxic fumes that drove those who inhaled them into madness. Temples across the Greek world became empty monuments to powers that would never again respond to human supplication, their altars cold, and their treasuries vulnerable to raiders who no longer feared divine retribution. The natural world experienced chaos that reflected the absence of divine beings who had maintained cosmic order through constant supernatural intervention. Seasonal cycles became unpredictable, as the death of gods responsible for agricultural fertility left crops dependent entirely on random weather patterns. The seas, no longer under Poseidon's guidance, developed currents and storm systems that followed no recognizable logic, making maritime trade and fishing extremely hazardous activities that many coastal communities simply abandoned. The underworld's collapse created the most immediate and terrifying consequences for human civilization, as the elimination of Hades left the boundary between life and death dangerously permeable. Spirits of the recently deceased began appearing in the mortal world with increasing frequency, carrying messages and memories that disturbed the living while seeking resolution for affairs they had been unable to complete before their deaths. The careful system of posthumous justice that had sorted souls according to their moral worth was replaced by a chaotic mixing of all the dead, creating spiritual pollution that affected entire regions. The Norse pantheon's reaction proved particularly significant for the future development of divine governance. as Odin and his family recognized that the complete elimination of a major mythological system set dangerous precedents for all cosmic rulers. Their response involved implementing reforms in their own divine society, designed to prevent the kinds of corruption and paranoia that had made the Olympians vulnerable to total destruction. The lessons of the war in Olympus became case studies in divine political science that influenced policy decisions throughout the Norse realms. The economic disruption caused by divine collapse extended far beyond the immediate Greek territories to affect trade networks that had depended on Olympian protection for their continued operation. Merchant ships that had once traveled safely under divine guarantee found themselves vulnerable to pirates and natural disasters that no supernatural force would prevent or punish. The insurance systems that had made long-distance commerce profitable collapsed when it became clear that divine enforcement of contracts was no longer available. The artistic and cultural renaissance that eventually emerged from the chaos of divine collapse reflected humanity's need to create meaning in a world where cosmic purpose could no longer be assumed to exist independently of human effort. Sculptors began creating works that celebrated mortal achievement rather than divine glory. Writers developed new literary forms that explored psychological complexity and moral ambiguity without reference to supernatural judgment. Musicians composed pieces that reflected the full range of human emotion without requiring divine inspiration or approval. The emergence of new religious movements that focused on ethical behavior rather than supernatural appeasement represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Olympian destruction. Populations that had lost faith in divine protection began developing spiritual practices that emphasized human responsibility for creating justice rather than relying on cosmic forces to reward virtue and punish vice. These movements would eventually influence the development of philosophical and religious traditions that extended far beyond the Mediterranean world. The gradual recognition that human civilization could survive and even flourish without divine micromanagement began to transform social attitudes toward authority in general. The spread of hope throughout the world, released from its imprisonment during the final battle between Zeus and Kratos, created subtle but profound changes in human consciousness that would take generations to fully manifest. Populations that had been trained to accept their suffering as divinely ordained began to envision possibilities for improvement that did not require supernatural intervention. The abstract force that had once been considered too dangerous to allow free expression became the foundation for social progress that transformed civilization across multiple continents. As the immediate shock of divine absence began to fade, the long-term implications of the war in Olympus started to become apparent. The universe had not ended with the death of the gods, but it had been fundamentally transformed in ways that would influence the development of both mortal and divine societies for millennia to come. The age of unquestioned divine authority was over, replaced by a new era in which cosmic power would be subject to moral evaluation by those it claimed to govern. The mythological legacy of the war in Olympus transcended the immediate destruction of a single pantheon to establish new principles of cosmic governance that would influence divine behavior across all mythological systems for countless generations. The precedent that gods could be held accountable for their actions through violent resistance created a fundamental shift in the relationship between divine authority and moral legitimacy that no supernatural ruler could afford to ignore. The influence on mortal governance structures proved equally profound as political leaders who had previously justified their authority through divine mandate found themselves forced to develop new forms of legitimacy based on consent and performance rather than supernatural appointment. The notion that even cosmic rulers could be overthrown when they became tyrants inspired democratic movements that challenged earthly despotism with unprecedented confidence in the possibility of successful resistance against seemingly insurmountable power. The hidden survivors of the Olympian pantheon, those few gods who had managed to escape the systematic destruction through cunning or exile, remained as potential sources of instability that threatened any attempt to establish new forms of cosmic order. These divine remnants plotted their return to power, while nursing grievances that had been intensified by witnessing the complete collapse of their civilization. Their existence created ongoing security concerns for other pantheons, who recognized that revenge-seeking Olympian survivors might attempt to destabilize any divine government that appeared vulnerable to infiltration or subversion. The psychological impact on mortal populations, who had witnessed the death of beings they had believed to be immortal, created forms of existential uncertainty that would influence philosophical and religious development for millennia. The realization that gods could die permanently forced reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about the nature of cosmic law and the reliability of supernatural promises. New forms of spiritual practice emerged that focused on human agency and moral development rather than divine intervention and cosmic favoritism. The technological innovations that had been inspired by divine knowledge began developing along different trajectories, as mortal inventors were forced to rely on human ingenuity rather than supernatural guidance. The absence of divine constraints on certain forms of research led to rapid advances in fields that had previously been restricted by religious taboos. However, the loss of divine protection also made technological development more dangerous, as mortals no longer had supernatural safeguards against the catastrophic consequences of scientific experimentation. The artistic legacy of the war manifested through cultural works that explored themes of resistance against tyranny and the moral complexity of violent revolution. Epic poems that had once celebrated divine glory were replaced by narratives that examined the psychological costs of both exercising and opposing absolute power. Sculptural traditions evolved to emphasize human dignity and achievement rather than supernatural magnificence. Musical compositions began incorporating dissonance and complexity that reflected the moral ambiguity of a universe where justice could only be achieved through destruction. The impact on other divine families became apparent as pantheons across the world implemented internal reforms designed to prevent the kind of familial dysfunction that had contributed to Olympian vulnerability. Norse gods established councils that could overrule individual divine decisions when they threatened cosmic stability. Egyptian deities created oversight mechanisms that monitored divine behavior for signs of corruption or paranoia. These preventive measures reflected widespread recognition that the patterns of divine governance needed fundamental revision to avoid repeating the catastrophic failures that had destroyed Olympus. The military lessons learned from observing the war influenced the development of new defensive strategies among both mortal and divine populations. The demonstration that concentrated moral purpose could overcome superior supernatural power led to innovations in asymmetric warfare that emphasized strategic patience and precise targeting over raw force. Divine generals began studying the tactics that had allowed Kratos to systematically eliminate opponents who possessed greater individual power, seeking to understand how moral legitimacy could be converted into military advantage. The economic consequences of divine collapse created new forms of commercial organization that did not depend on supernatural enforcement of contracts or divine protection of trade routes. Merchant associations developed internal arbitration systems that could resolve disputes without invoking cosmic authority. Insurance mechanisms evolved to account for risks that could no longer be mitigated through religious observance or divine favor. These innovations represented adaptations to a world where human institutions needed to function independently of supernatural support. The educational transformations that followed Olympian destruction involved the systematic revision of curricula that had previously emphasized divine authority and supernatural explanation for natural phenomena. New scholarly traditions emerged that valued empirical observation and logical reasoning over revealed truth and divine inspiration. The preservation of knowledge became a human responsibility rather than a divine prerogative, leading to the development of libraries and schools designed to survive without supernatural protection. The diplomatic implications for inter-pantheon relations created new frameworks for cosmic cooperation that emphasized mutual accountability rather than hierarchical dominance. Treaties between different divine systems began including provisions for moral oversight and mechanisms for addressing divine misconduct before it could escalate into the kind of systemic corruption that had destroyed the Olympians. These agreements reflected recognition that the stability of all mythological systems depended on preventing any single pantheon from accumulating unchecked power. The long-term influence on concepts of justice extended far beyond the immediate participants in the war to affect legal and moral philosophy across multiple civilizations. The principle that authority must be earned through ethical behavior rather than assumed through superior power became a foundational concept in legal systems that sought to prevent the abuse of governmental authority. The notion that resistance to tyranny was not just permissible but morally required influenced revolutionary movements that would reshape human society for centuries. The spiritual evolution that emerged from the war's aftermath involved the development of religious practices that emphasized personal moral development over institutional authority. New forms of meditation and ethical discipline arose that sought to cultivate the kind of inner strength that had allowed Kratos to challenge cosmic tyranny. These practices reflected understanding that external divine protection was unreliable, making individual moral development essential for navigating a universe where justice depended more on human effort than supernatural intervention. As the full scope of the war's consequences became apparent across successive generations, it became clear that the destruction of Olympus had marked not just the end of one divine dynasty, but the beginning of a new age in cosmic history, where divine authority would forever be subject to moral evaluation by those it claimed to govern. The modern discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of the war in Olympus emerge from archaeological sites across the Mediterranean world, where evidence of divine conflict contradicts the sanitized versions of events that survived in classical literature. The influence of the Olympian War on Kratos' eventual journey to the Norse realms becomes apparent when examining the psychological patterns that drove his transition from Greek revenge to Nordic redemption. The implications for all pantheons and systems of divine rule extend far beyond the immediate participants in the Greek divine civil war to encompass fundamental questions about the sustainability of cosmic governance based on hierarchical authority rather than moral accountability. The connections to other mythological threats and the higher plane of existence suggest that the war in Olympus was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of cosmic instability that affects all divine systems when they become disconnected from the principles of justice. And the parallels between the Olympian War and the approaching Ragnarok that would eventually consume the Norse pantheon demonstrate that divine dynasties across different mythological systems face similar challenges when their authority becomes based more on force than legitimacy. The patterns of corruption, paranoia, and family dysfunction that destroyed Zeus and his family can be observed developing within Odin's regime, suggesting that the cycle of divine rise and fall operates according to principles that transcend individual pantheons or cultural contexts. The role of hope, as a cosmic force that was released during the final battle, continues to influence events across multiple realms and mythological systems in ways that are only beginning to be understood. This abstract power that had been imprisoned because of its potential to inspire resistance against tyranny has fundamentally altered the relationship between divine authority and mortal aspirations, creating possibilities for social and spiritual development that would have been impossible under the old systems of cosmic governance. The emergence of new forms of divine authority that attempt to learn from Olympian failures represents ongoing experiments in supernatural governance that seek to balance cosmic power with moral accountability. These developing systems face the challenge of maintaining divine effectiveness while avoiding the corruption and isolation that made the Olympians vulnerable to total destruction through popular uprising and systematic elimination. The technological and magical innovations that were lost with the destruction of Olympian civilization continue to influence archaeological research as scholars attempt to reconstruct divine knowledge that could benefit modern populations. The weapons, artifacts, and architectural techniques that were developed during the war represent advances in supernatural science that might be recoverable through careful study of divine ruins and surviving magical traditions. The impact on cosmic law and the fundamental principles that govern reality itself remains an active area of mystical research as practitioners attempt to understand how the elimination of beings who embodied natural forces has affected the stability of physical and metaphysical systems. The death of gods who controlled specific aspects of cosmic function created disruptions that continue to manifest through anomalous phenomena that defy conventional scientific explanation. The influence on mortal spiritual development has accelerated the evolution of religious and philosophical traditions that emphasize personal moral growth over institutional authority and divine favor. The demonstration that gods can be held accountable for their actions has inspired human spiritual practices that focus on cultivating the kind of inner strength and moral clarity that can challenge even supernatural tyranny when necessary. The potential for similar conflicts in other mythological systems creates ongoing concerns among divine scholars who monitor inter-pantheon relations for signs of the corruption and dysfunction that preceded Olympian collapse. The lessons learned from the war in Olympus have become essential knowledge for anyone seeking to understand cosmic politics and the factors that determine whether divine rule serves cosmic justice or merely perpetuates organized oppression on a supernatural scale. The transformation of Kratos from an instrument of divine vengeance into a teacher of wisdom and restraint reflects the broader evolution of consciousness that has emerged from the war's aftermath. His journey from rage-driven destroyer to thoughtful mentor demonstrates that even the most violent revolutions can ultimately serve constructive purposes when they eliminate systems that cannot be reformed through peaceful means. The ongoing mystery of what cosmic forces will emerge to fill the void left by Olympian destruction continues to influence political and spiritual developments across multiple realms. The recognition that divine authority is not eternal or inevitable has created opportunities for new forms of cosmic organization that might prove more stable and just than the hierarchical systems that have traditionally governed supernatural politics. The war in Olympus stands as the definitive demonstration that no power, however ancient or seemingly absolute, can survive the accumulated consequences of its own moral failures. The fall of Zeus and his pantheon echoes across all realms as both warning and promise that tyranny contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that from the ashes of corrupt divine rule, something better might yet emerge to serve the cause of cosmic justice that transcends the ambitions of any individual god or pantheon. The silence where Olympian voices once commanded obedience now resonates with possibilities that no divine authority, no matter how mighty, can entirely control or predict